No, again. With the increasing popularity of MP Rupert Lowe and his new political party Restore, the idea of deporting millions of people is increasingly being discussed. Much of Lowe's popularity is founded upon this idea of deporting millions of people. He openly suggests that it would be a good idea. I thought that it might be interesting to think about what such a project would entail. There are at least 2 million illegal immigrants in Britain is indisputably true. The number of visitors from abroad who arrive and do not leave, combined with the many students who remain after their university course is finished, those two categories alone will easily run into a couple of million. How easy, though, would it be to remove them from the country? I'm leaving aside any ethical considerations, that is to say, whether it would be right to do such a thing. How could it be done? Let's assume to begin with that we are going to achieve this in the course of a single parliament. 5 years. That is the implication of those who say that there must be no shilly-shallying or delays. The removal of 2 million people over the course of the lifetime of one parliament. Let's also limit our commitment to getting rid of just 2 million of those illegal immigrants. A quick calculation tells us that we must be arresting and removing them at a rate of around 1,100 a day, 7 days a week for 5 years, if we wish to get the job done within those 5 years. I think, too, that we can reasonably assume that each of those arrested people will need to be held for at least a couple of weeks before we can arrange a flight out of the country. I doubt it would be possible to arrest them and then drive them straight to an airport and put them on a waiting plane, not when we are dealing with over 1,000 a day. Some sort of facilities would need to be set up to hold them until we can deal with the paperwork and send them back to their own country. I'm guessing that those who advocate this plan will wish to streamline the process, and so we must take it for granted that habeas corpus will have been suspended and that there will be no appeals allowed through the courts against deportation orders. If we factored in such delays, then it would take a lot more than a fortnight to deport somebody. We come here to the first problem, which is that if we are arresting 1,100 men a day, and it is mainly men, and then holding them in custody for a fortnight, then we're going to need some new facilities that can hold over 15,000 people securely without the risk of their escaping. These will be the people we are detaining prior to arranging flights for them. There's no room in prisons or police stations for an extra 15,000 people. There's barely any space at all, just as it is at the moment. These uh, people are going to be determined to escape, so we're going to have to need to build special camps to hold them. I think it's safe to say that many of them will be determined not to be deported, and so these camps will have to be surrounded by barbed wire and be well guarded. The inmates will, of course, need to be fed while they're there, and various ancillary staff will be needed apart from those arresting them and guarding them. We're going to need thousands of men to guard them. No existing facilities in this country are likely to be able to hold 15,000 men who are being held in this way against their will. It would be necessary to construct these places from scratch. Our army is stretched very thin at the moment, and I doubt if they'd be able to spare a couple of regiments to guard these new detention camps, which would mean recruiting an entirely new force to do so. I cannot imagine, by the way, that one camp holding over 15,000 men would be either practical or desirable, so we are really talking of a network of small camps, perhaps built around major airports. What of those whose job it will be to track down and detain by force those 1,100 people every day? Home Office immigration caseworkers are not going to be much use for such a massive and continuous operation, one which will have to be running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, if we are to have any hope of removing 2 million people in 5 years. We would have to set up and recruit staff for a new paramilitary body, which would need to be authorised to use lethal force if needed, because there will be stiff resistance to this operation if it took place, not only from the immigrants themselves, but also from left-wing allies who would work to frustrate the aim of the deportation program. We've seen this in the United States, of course. I suppose that we might recruit some of this new force from the army and police, and also from the thousands of security staff, which you see all over the place these days. Of course, most of them are either Asian or black themselves, so I'm not sure if that's going to work too well. Not a few of them are also illegal immigrants, by the way. Let us pause for a moment now and ask ourselves what we have had to do, even to launch this policy of deporting millions of people from Britain. I'm taking it for granted that any administration which embarked on such a course of action would have withdrawn from the European Convention on Human Rights. We must take that as a given. But in order to prevent endless appeals through the courts, the government would also have to suspend habeas corpus. In other words, do away with one of our fundamental liberties, the protection from arbitrary arrest. This has been done before. It happened during the Second World War, of course. And it was also done in Northern Ireland during the Troubles when internment was in operation. But I'm not sure how keen the average citizen would feel about scrapping habeas corpus these days. Then there is the question of setting up what are, in effect, concentration camps, where people are being held without being brought before the courts and with no recourse to law. I rather think that even the most determined supporter of Rupert Lowe or Nigel Farage might draw the line at camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, into which thousands of men, women, and children are herded and held for as long as we feel necessary. What we would have to do, in other words, is to transform Britain from a liberal democracy into something with distinct similarities, in parts, to Nazi Germany. I'm sure that some would think this no bad thing, but I also feel that many people calling for mass deportations on that scale haven't thought through the implications of what they are demanding. I think before setting off down such a road, it is just as well that we know precisely what we would be signing up for.